Among the many soldiers of Easy Company, whose stories were told in the Band of Brothers series, one of the most puzzling figures was Roy W. Cobb. The final time viewers saw Cobb on screen was in Episode 8, The Last Patrol, when he was driven away from the front lines in Hagenau inside a jeep escorted by military police. After that moment, the character vanished from the series entirely. The actor who played him, Craig Heaney, has rarely spoken publicly about either the role or the real man behind it. Yet Cobb's name does appear occasionally in interviews and recollections from Easy Company veterans. Harry Welsh and George Lewes both mentioned him while discussing the flak that struck their aircraft before the Normandy jump. Another soldier, Johnny Martin, who served in the same platoon, remembered Cobb during the fierce fighting on the island during Operation Market Garden in September 1944. Martin recalled an encounter with a group of German troops concealed along a row of bushes. According to him, dozens of enemy soldiers were lying in wait. Cobb, who was operating a machine gun, reacted quickly. Martin remembered that Cobb opened fire and cut them down before they could act. Martin also shared a few personal impressions. Cobb, he said, came from Harlan County, Kentucky. He could be troublesome and often caused headaches for his superiors, but he also had a useful talent. He was the platoon's best scrounger. Cobb frequently slipped away to find food or supplies and returned with something the men could eat. At the same time, Martin remembered that Cobb rarely seemed satisfied and was almost always complaining about something. Later accounts of Cobb during the war come mainly from David Webster and Clancy Lyle. By 1945, Webster and Cobb were both serving in the 1st Platoon while stationed near Hagenau. Webster's memoir does not portray Cobb as especially hostile or unusual. In fact, Webster even described him as friendly, which contrasts sharply with the aggressive personality shown in the television series. Ironically, in the show, Cobb often directs his anger toward Webster himself. Clancy Lyle also remembered Cobb somewhat differently from the television portrayal. According to Lyle, Cobb could be a decent man, as long as alcohol was not involved. This raises an important question. Why did Band of Brothers focus so strongly on Cobb and depict him so negatively? The character first appears prominently in Episode 3, Replacements, where he is introduced as loud, rude, and openly antagonistic. Yet the timeline in the series is misleading. Although the show depicts him training with Easy Company at Camp Toccoa and Fort Benning in 1942 and early 1943, Cobb did not actually join the company until late 1943, when the regiment was stationed at Fort Bragg. That discrepancy alone suggests the show took liberties with his story. Another alteration involves a confrontation in Hagenau. In Stephen Ambrose's book, the conflict occurred between Cobb and Lieutenant Jack Foley. In the television adaptation, however, the argument is instead shown between Cobb and Second Lieutenant Henry Jones, a replacement officer. The change significantly alters the historical narrative. There is actually no proof at all that Cobb was arrested or charged. He was likely confused with another man, Wiseman, who had been scrounging with Cobb and with whom he'd had a confrontation with. Ambrose's book also includes an intriguing claim about Cobb's earlier service. According to the author, Cobb had previously served with the 1st Armored Division between 1941 and 1943 and participated in the North African Campaign following Operation Torch in November 1942. Ambrose further wrote that Cobb's troop transport was torpedoed by a German submarine during the voyage home, and that Cobb survived the sinking. The problem is that this story appears almost nowhere else. It has been repeated frequently online, but always traced back to Ambrose's book. The Band of Brothers production series Bible, which was based largely on Ambrose's notes, even states that Cobb came from Colorado, a detail that conflicts with later evidence. Because Cobb died decades before the book was written, the story could not have come directly from him. In fact, after Easy Company was deactivated in November 1945, Cobb's whereabouts were largely unknown. Post-war rosters simply listed his location as unknown, and he seemed to vanish from the historical record. Either a veteran shared the earlier story of his service with Ambrose, or it may have been a case of mistaken identity. Several men named Roy Cobb lived in the United States at the time, which may have contributed to confusion. Even modern researchers have sometimes followed the wrong trail when trying to reconstruct his life. This uncertainty is striking considering how prominent Cobb appears in the television series. In reality, his documented footprint is surprisingly small, leaving historians to piece together fragments of information about a man who became a major character in the dramatized story. The mystery deepens because Cobb's official military records appear difficult to access. Attempts to obtain them from the National Archives have produced little result, possibly because some records were destroyed in archival fires or remain restricted. Another figure connected to Cobb's story is Lieutenant Jack Foley. Foley reportedly provided extensive information to Stephen Ambrose, but some veterans, among them Colonel Robert Strayer, later expressed frustration about inaccuracies in Foley's accounts. Even Dick Winters wrote in letters that certain claims from Foley were not entirely reliable. Curiously, David Webster never mentioned the supposed confrontation between Cobb and Foley in his detailed writings about the events at Hagenau. Nevertheless, other sources suggest that some form of incident did occur. One event we can confirm took place during the Normandy invasion. Cobb did not jump on D-Day because he was wounded before leaving the aircraft. George Luce recalled that as the paratroopers prepared to jump, he worried he might struggle to exit the plane from his position while carrying extra radio equipment. Lieutenant Welsh told him to switch places with Cobb, who had been standing fourth in line. As their C-47 approached the Normandy coast, heavy anti-aircraft fire struck the aircraft. A fragment of shrapnel tore through the floor and ceiling of the plane, hitting Cobb in the process. The impact knocked him down, and when Welsh asked if he could stand, Cobb said he could not. Welsh ordered him to remain aboard the aircraft rather than attempt the jump. When the damaged plane returned to England, Cobb received treatment in a hangar at Pottery Airfield. According to Clancy Lyle, he was then kept under guard for 2 days. This unusual measure had been ordered by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who required soldiers returning from Normandy to remain isolated briefly so that sensitive information would not leak. During that time, Cobb reportedly passed the hours by counting bullet holes in the aircraft that had nearly killed him. Eventually, he was transferred to a hospital and stayed there until Easy Company returned to England after the Normandy campaign. When Cobb reappears in Band of Brothers beginning in Episode 3, he is portrayed as an aggressive bully. One memorable scene shows him criticizing Private James Miller for wearing the Presidential Unit citation. However, there is no historical evidence confirming that the event ever occurred. Miller was later killed in Holland, and the other replacements who were present never mentioned the confrontation in interviews. In reality, Easy Company's commander, Captain Dick Winters, had instructed the new replacements to wear the citation despite their hesitation. That makes the scene appear to be an invention designed to establish Cobb as a hostile personality within the show. Other details in the series are also inaccurate. For example, Cobb is depicted running through the fighting in the Dutch town of Nieuwenen with a grease gun. In fact, he served as a light machine gunner in 1st Platoon. Little is known about his actions during the Battle of the Bulge in Bastogne. Records confirm he was present, as his name appears on rosters compiled by Bert Christensen, but few soldiers wrote about him during that campaign. Later, during the events dramatized in Episode 8, Easy Company conducted a patrol across the river near Hagenau. The show presents the mission as controversial and tense, but in reality the patrol seems to have been carried out with less drama than depicted. Cobb participated in the operation, and the series accurately shows his raft capsizing during the crossing. According to Webster's account, Cobb returned to the command post afterward. There he encountered another soldier named Wiseman from the 3rd Platoon, and the two began searching nearby houses for schnapps. After discovering several bottles, they drank heavily and eventually got into a drunken argument. The following morning, Cobb reportedly noticed a wounded German prisoner left behind on the far side of the river. Webster wrote that Cobb slipped down to the riverbank and threw a grenade toward the injured man, killing him. That was the last time Webster mentioned Cobb in his memoir. Ambrose's book describes additional trouble later that day. Still intoxicated, Cobb allegedly clashed with Lieutenant Jack Foley, the leader of 1st Platoon. Foley accused him of being drunk while on duty. Cobb reportedly rushed toward the officer, but was restrained before things escalated further. During the confrontation, Sergeant John Martin drew his .45 pistol, but was ordered to put it away. Military police soon arrested Cobb and escorted him to regimental headquarters. Martin confirmed that the incident happened, but insisted he never intended to shoot Cobb. In his words, Cobb had simply become a little haywire. After that moment, Martin said little more about him. Ambrose also wrote that Colonel Robert Sink, upon hearing about the altercation, angrily remarked that Foley should have shot Cobb. In the television version, however, the argument is shown between Cobb and Lieutenant Henry Jones instead of Foley. Whether Cobb actually faced a court-martial remains unclear. According to company rosters compiled by Bert Christensen, Cobb was transferred out of Easy Company after the Hagenau episode and placed in Headquarters Company for the remainder of the war. One famous photograph, taken in Austria near the end of the war, has often been said to include Cobb among the soldiers. For decades, the trail of Roy Cobb's life seemed to end there. Then, while reviewing John Martin's interview transcripts, researchers noticed Martin's comment that Cobb came from Harlan County, Kentucky. That small detail helped modern investigators finally identify him. Further research uncovered records pointing to a man named Roy William Cobb, born March 4, 1922, in Harlan County. A document requesting a veteran's grave marker, submitted by his mother, Nancy Scarborough, listed a service number matching a soldier from the 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. According to those records, Cobb enlisted on April 15, 1941, and was discharged on February 27, 1948. The form also indicated that he had served in Headquarters Company near the end of his career, explaining why he disappeared from Easy Company rosters after Hagenau. It listed awards including the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star. Census records show that Cobb grew up in Harlan County with his mother, stepfather, and several siblings. Later documents suggest that he often went by the name Ray rather than Roy. Ornispornifor newspaper report mentioned that PFC Roy Cobb, son of Nancy Scarborough, had been wounded in action in Europe. The timing strongly suggests that the article referred to the injuries he received when his aircraft was hit by flak during the Normandy invasion. Post-war records hint at a difficult life. In the 1950 census, a man identified as Ray Cobb appears as a prisoner in the Harlan County Jail, listed as a 28-year-old coal miner who was out of work. The same record shows him living with his mother along with his wife Marie and 2 children, Raymond and Rose. Evidence suggests that Marie was originally from Belgium and that their son Raymond had been born there in 1947, possibly while Cobb was still stationed in Europe after the war. Their daughter Rose was born in Kentucky 2 years later. At some point, Cobb moved west. Records from the California Death Index show that he died in Sacramento on April 23, 1964, at just 41 years old. His body was returned to Kentucky for burial, according to the Sacramento Bee. On Friday, April 24, 1964, 2 men were killed last night when an automobile they were pushing suddenly reversed and back up over them on the Elkhorn Road near El Centro Road. They were Barry Dwayne Dyer, 23, Richmond, Contra Costa County, and Roy William Cobb, 42, of Knights Landing, Yolo County. The driver, Kenneth W. Fetty, 36, of Richmond, was booked in the county jail on a charge of felony drunk driving and manslaughter. He was uninjured. Highway patrolmen J.L. Ball and W.H. Halstead reported the men were in a car which ran over a reflector-type marker on the side of the road. The auto became stalled on the sign, which stands nearly 3 feet high. The officers said Dyer and Cobb got out and began pushing the vehicle from behind to dislodge it from the sign. Another passenger, Frank C. Essick of Rio Linda, was pushing on one side. Essick told the patrolman the engine was revved and the wheels were spinning when the car suddenly shot backward, hitting Dyer and Cobb and rolling down a bank off the road. Dyer and Cobb died before they reached the Sacramento hospital in an ambulance. While many details of his life remain uncertain, including the stories about North Africa, one thing seems clear: Roy W. Cobb was far more accomplished than the abrasive character portrayed in Band of Brothers. Like many soldiers of Easy Company, his real story is fragmented, scattered across memories, records, and unanswered questions.